She needed shelter. He needed a wife, but neither expected to find love. Clara Mae Whitmore was a battlefield nurse, hardened by war, haunted by loss, and left with nothing but her hands and her pride. When the world turned its back on her, the Wyoming wind was the only thing that still remembered her name. Desperate and nearly frozen, she was given a choice: marry a stranger, or return to the streets that never missed her. Jeremiah Boone, a wealthy rancher bound by law and loss, needed a wife to keep custody of his late daughter's child. He didn't ask for love, just obedience. But what happens when two broken souls make a bargain neither of them truly understands? What would you do if survival meant binding your life to someone you barely knew? This is not a love story wrapped in silk and sunshine. It's built on silence, stitched with sorrow, and mended by moments of grace. If your heart's ever been bruised, this story might speak to you. Stay with us at Wild West Echoes, where forgotten voices find their home again. If this touched you, leave a comment. Your words are how we keep these stories alive. Now, let's begin. The wind cut through her coat like knives through old scars. Clara Mae Whitmore had nowhere left to go and nowhere she belonged. The road behind her was gone, swallowed by snow and regret. Ahead of her, just more white. A blank canvas with no brush, no artist, no promise. Her steps, slow and uneven, left shallow imprints that vanished almost as quickly as they were made. Wyoming's wind didn't care for memories. It wiped everything clean: footprints, tears, names whispered under breath. Clara hadn't cried since the trenches, but tonight the corners of her eyes stung not from sorrow, but from the bite of the cold. The kind of cold that reached past skin, past bone, down into the places where old pain still lived. It clung to her like shame. She adjusted her scarf for the 100th time, fingers trembling inside threadbare gloves. Her coat, once navy blue and military sharp, had faded to a weary gray, the edges frayed like pages of a book read too many times. Her boots, long past their prime, were caked in salt and slush, and her toes burned with that dangerous, dull kind of numbness. Clara had been a healer once, a good one, too. Back in the war, soldiers called her Saint Whitmore not out of reverence, but out of the kind of desperate humor that grows in muddy tents with dying men. She'd seen things, done things, kept her head when others couldn't. But no medal had followed her home, no parade, just silence, and then suspicion. The people in her hometown couldn't understand why a woman would go to war, why she came back alone, why she didn't want to talk about what she'd seen. So they stopped asking, and then they stopped speaking altogether. She'd wandered for months since then, never staying long, never expecting kindness. The name Clara Mae once meant something to her. Now it was just something she answered to. Elk Rock had been her last hope, a small town tucked into the folds of Wyoming's rugged hills. She'd read about it in a letter left behind by a fellow nurse, a place where the mountains were high, the winters harsh, but the heart still warm. But winter had arrived before opportunity did, and warmth was a luxury she couldn't afford. 4 weeks she'd been at the Maple Inn. Mr. Calloway, the innkeeper, was a veteran like her. He hadn't smiled much, but he'd let her work off her stay sweeping, washing linens, tending to the coughs and fevers of his guests. It wasn't much, but it was a roof, until this morning. "I'm sorry, Clara," he'd said, voice low. "Rooms are full, storm's coming. I have to charge full price or give it to someone who can." She'd nodded, no argument, no plea. She understood. She always understood. Now, she was walking. Or, rather, drifting through snow, through memory, through the numb spaces between decisions. Her satchel bounced lightly against her hip with each step, inside. The last remnants of a life, a worn Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins. A change of underclothes, a silver thimble, and a letter from a father who'd stopped writing when she came back wearing pants and carrying stories he didn't want to hear. She passed the edge of town just before sundown, following the fence line that bordered the road like a guardrail against despair. The wind howled down the ridge, fierce and familiar. She'd heard the same scream above field hospitals, ripping through canvas tents while lanterns swayed like ghosts. Her knees buckled once, but she didn't fall. Not yet. She kept walking, past a split tree where someone had once carved a heart, past a frozen trough where horses no longer drank, past memory after memory that wasn't hers but tried to claim her anyway. Then, without drama or sound, her body gave up. She crumpled to the ground, snow wrapping around her like a mother she didn't remember, her cheek pressed against ice. She didn't cry, didn't move. The silence was complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through sagebrush. But in the silence, something stirred not outside, but within. A thought, a voice. "You're a Whitmore. You don't quit." Her father's voice, from another life. She didn't want to remember him, but the voice brought heat to her cheeks, stubborn and old. It brought shame, and then fire. Clara pushed up on her elbows. Her breath came ragged, sharp, her vision blurred. Then there it was, a flicker of gold in the distance, a light. She blinked. Once, twice, still there. It shimmered faintly behind the snow, tucked behind a rise. A cabin, a porch lamp, the kind of warm, yellow light that could only mean hearth, fire, maybe people, or maybe not. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks, tossing hope into a hopeless place. Still, light was light, and for people like her, even the memory of warmth was enough to move toward it. She gripped the fence post beside her, splinters digging into her gloves. She stood, shaking, teeth clenched. "One more mile," she whispered, though she had no idea how far it was. One more mile, toward the light, toward something, or nothing. But at least it wasn't behind her. She took a step, then another, and the wind at her back, cold, cruel, insistent, pushed her forward. Behind a tall wooden gate stood a man who hadn't smiled in years. Jeremiah Boone was not the kind of man who invited strangers into his home. His gate was heavy, bolted with thick iron, and rarely opened to anyone who didn't bring tools, feed, or official papers. He wasn't cruel, just quiet, a quiet man with too much land, too many memories, and no patience left for conversation. It had been nearly 5 years since his wife died. The accident was fast, senseless, a broken wheel on a mountain road, a wagon overturned, and just like that, the two people who filled his home with warmth were gone. His wife, Anna, his daughter, Sadie. The names still hung in the house, stitched into quilts, etched on the back of rocking chairs, tucked into the corners of every room like ghost shadows that refused to leave. After the funerals, Jeremiah stopped talking much. He managed the ranch with efficiency, not affection. The hands knew not to linger. The neighbors gave him distance. He never remarried, never even entertained the thought. Then came the letter. A child. Anna's niece left behind after a fever swept through her kin. Her name was Lila, 6 years old, no one else to take her. The county offered 2 choices: she could be taken in by the state, or Jeremiah could assume guardianship. He hadn't hesitated. Blood was blood. And even if his own heart had stopped wanting, he wouldn't let a Boone child be raised by strangers. But now, with Lila in his care, he was faced with another problem. The state wanted a stable household, a proper home. They made it clear a man alone, with no female presence, no caretaker, no mother figure, was not an ideal guardian. He wasn't about to lose another child. So, when the owner of the Elk Rock Pharmacy knocked on his door last night with a story about a woman wandering into the storm, he listened, a veteran, unmarried, educated, desperate, someone who had nothing and no one, and maybe, just maybe, someone who needed something as badly as he did. That morning, Jeremiah stood just beyond the gate, coat flapping in the wind, as the woman approached. She was thinner than he expected, pale, tired in the eyes, but upright, resilient. She didn't flinch as the wind slapped her cheeks red. She looked him straight on. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked, voice low and gruff. "Yes," she said, breath catching from the climb up his long, snowy path. I'm Jeremiah Boone. You came recommended? He stepped aside. Come in. She hesitated at the gate, her eyes flicking to the land behind him, vast fields, corrals, the faint outline of a barn, and further still, the silhouette of a house, two chimneys curling smoke into the cold sky. He didn't offer small talk. He didn't ask how she was feeling or if she needed a warm drink. He led her through the snow in silence, boots crunching in rhythm beside hers. Inside. The house was clean but sparse. Fireplaces glowed low in two rooms. The walls were lined with shelves of books and old photographs. The scent of pine wood and tobacco lingered in the air. Jeremiah motioned for her to sit, then pulled a chair for himself. He didn't touch the coffee on the table. I'll speak plain. Miss Whitmore, he said. You need a roof. I need a wife. Clara blinked, her breath, still visible from the cold, caught in her throat. I'm not asking for love, he continued, unbothered by her silence. Not even company, but the law is what it is. The girl Lila, she needs a mother on paper, or they'll take her. He leaned back, hands clasped loosely on his lap. You'll have a room, meals, firewood. You don't owe me anything else. Just sign the papers, be present, and help with the girl. Clara didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced. A wife. The word landed like a stone in her chest. She'd never even been courted properly. War had stolen that part of her life. Now, here was a stranger, offering her the role without affection, without pretense. She studied him. His beard was trimmed, his posture rigid but not aggressive. He didn't leer, he didn't beg. He spoke like a man who had buried too many things and wanted no more surprises. What happens if I say no? She asked, voice calm. I'll find someone else, he said simply. But I'd rather not. She looked at her hands gloved, damp from snow. Her knuckles were cracked. Her future stretched out like the empty land outside. A roof, a bed, a name that might protect her from the whispers, and a child, one who, like her, had lost too much too soon. Clara closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, not in fear, just to feel her heartbeat steady. All right, she said softly. I'll do it. Jeremiah nodded once. No smile, no relief, just a quiet exhale, like someone accepting the terms of a truce. I'll have the papers drawn tomorrow. You can stay in the west room. He stood and opened the study door, revealing a long hallway. At the far end, a staircase. Clara stood, her knees aching from cold and from decision. As she followed him, her fingers brushed the wall. It was warm, solid, real, and behind her, the front door clicked shut, not slammed, not locked, just shut. A chapter closed, a new one unwritten, waiting in the stillness. The child's eyes held a silence louder than screams. Lila Boone sat at the far end of the parlor, curled up on a faded floral settee, her knees drawn to her chest like a wall she'd built long ago. A patchwork quilt covered half her small frame, but her fingers were bare, tiny, red-tipped, always tugging at loose threads. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched, as if any sound might break something fragile inside her. Clara stood in the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, unsure whether to speak or wait. She had seen children hurt before on hospital cots, with fevered eyes and trembling limbs, but this quiet was different. Not the silence of pain, but of withdrawal. Lila didn't look at her. Not really. Just past her. Through her. Hello, Lila, Clara said gently. Her voice softened like snow on pine. The girl blinked. Once. No response. Clara stepped inside the room, her boots muted by the braided rug. A small fire danced in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the floor. She noticed a worn doll tucked behind the cushions, one button eye missing, its yarn hair frayed. Clara crouched slowly, mindful not to seem too big, too sudden. I like your quilt, she tried again. My mama made one just like it when I was little. Only mine had sunflowers. Lila's gaze didn't waver. Her fingers kept tugging at the thread. From the hallway, Jeremiah's boots echoed softly as he passed. He glanced into the room, nodded once toward Clara, then disappeared into the study without a word. The man was like a shadow stitched into the walls always nearby, never quite there. Clara exhaled quietly. This would take time. Later that evening, after supper, quiet, plain. With spoons clinking gently against bowls, Clara cleared the dishes while Lila sat stiffly at the table. She didn't eat much, just pushed the potatoes around her plate and kept one arm wrapped protectively around her middle. "Would you like to help dry the dishes?" Clara offered, holding up a clean towel. Lila stood and left the room without answering. That night, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the plain walls of the west room. A single oil lamp cast a circle of amber light on the small desk by the window. Outside, wind stirred the tree limbs like brittle fingers against the glass. She pulled her shawl tighter, her heart heavy in a way that surprised her. She had thought loneliness was an ache she'd already come to know. But this was different. This was a loneliness that echoed through corridors and small silences, through half-filled bowls and a child's eyes that never met hers. In town, things weren't kinder. When Clara ventured into Elk Rock the next day to fetch sugar and flour, the air shifted around her like it always did around strangers. Eyes lingered too long, conversations hushed mid-sentence. At the general store, the clerk, a woman with silver hair and narrowed eyes, raised an eyebrow when Clara introduced herself. "Boone's wife." "Huh," the woman said, setting down a jar of molasses with more force than necessary. "Didn't waste time, did he?" Clara bit back a reply, choosing instead to smile politely and count her coins. Outside, two young mothers whispered behind gloved hands. One of them said the word replacement loud enough for Clara to hear. By the time she returned to the ranch, snow had begun to fall again. She shook off her coat at the door and stepped inside, greeted not by words, but by stillness. Lila was in the front room, sitting on the floor with colored pencils and scrap paper spread out like a fragile puzzle. Clara paused, unsure if she should approach. Then she saw it. A drawing, simple, crude lines, but clear enough. A woman with long hair, holding a small child, the sun overhead, flowers at their feet. Lila colored the dress carefully blue. Clara recognized the shape. The woman in the drawing wore a long braid, like the one Lila often touched in her sleep. It was her mother, Anna. Clara took a tentative step closer, kneeling beside the child. "That's beautiful. Lila," she said softly. "Is that your mama?" Lila's hand froze. She looked up not through Clara, but at her, really at her. Then, slowly, with trembling fingers, she tore the drawing in half, and then in half again, and again, until it was nothing but pieces in her lap. Clara said nothing. Her throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to gather the pieces, to say something kind or wise. But she didn't, because the pieces weren't meant to be saved. Not yet. Instead, she sat there, quiet, still, just breathing beside the child who wouldn't smile. When Lila finally stood and left the room, Clara gathered the scraps and placed them gently in a box by the fire, not to throw away, just to keep, in case. Later that night, alone again in the west room, Clara sat in silence. The oil lamp flickered beside her, casting shadows across her hands. She had not come here to be a mother. She hadn't even known if she could be one. But now, with each moment, each glance, each quiet heartbreak, the question gnawed deeper. How do you become a mother if no one wants to be your child? She looked toward the dark hallway, where a little girl slept in a too large bed. She had no answer, only the will to try again tomorrow. They called her the stray who married for money. It began with murmurs soft, almost kind, the kind of whispers that pretended not to sting. Then came the looks, the long ones that didn't blink, the ones that turned corners of mouths downward, like Clara had tracked something foul in with her boots. She had hoped for a quieter life in Elk Rock, not warm, perhaps, but fair. a place where effort meant something. But fairness was rare in small towns, especially for women without history, or worse, women with too much of it. When Clara walked to the general store for flour, the clerk didn't bother hiding her stare. "You're Boone's bride?" she asked, drawing out the last word like it was something bitter on her tongue. Clara nodded, setting down a small tin of sugar. "Yes." "Ma'am." The clerk's mouth twitched. "Quick thing, wasn't it?" Clara didn't answer. There was nothing in her she wanted to waste on people who had already made up their minds. Later, at the seamstress's shop, things cut sharper. The bell above the door jingled as Clara entered, brushing snow from her sleeves. The shop was warm, smelling faintly of wool and lavender, but the woman behind the counter didn't offer a smile. "You'll want thread, I assume," she said flatly, not looking up from her measuring tape. "I was hoping for a few yards of calico. Lila's sleeves are too short," Clara said, trying for polite. The seamstress set down her tape and met Clara's eyes. "I didn't realize Boone's new wife sewed." Clara kept her hands steady. "I try to—" The woman's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something sour. "They say you came with nothing but a war bag and nerves frayed as ribbon. Yet here you are, with a child and a ranch under your feet. Some folks just land lucky." Clara felt the weight behind those words. They weren't curiosity. They were accusation, dressed in neighborly tones. She left with the fabric, but no goodwill. Back at the ranch, life settled into quiet rhythm. Clara learned where the floorboards creaked, how the chimney drew best if the back flue stayed open. She tended the hens, chopped kindling with a rhythm she remembered from field work. Her body, though tired, remembered labor. It was her spirit that felt heavier. Lila still kept her distance, but the girl watched her more now. At supper, she sat a little closer. Once, she even let Clara braid her hair before bed, though she said nothing, and unbraided it silently after. Jeremiah remained unchanged. He was present, but remote, like a stone wall, solid, dependable, but offering no shelter. They exchanged words when needed about the land, the meals, the child, but nothing more. He never asked how her days were. He didn't notice when her hands cracked from the cold water. Or if he did. He never said. One afternoon, while returning from the post office, Clara paused at the edge of the town square. The wind had eased. The light was soft, winter gold. She heard laughter bright and real, and turned to see a small group of women sitting on the porch of the milliner's shop, sewing in the fading sun. When she approached, the laughter dimmed, threads slowed. One woman offered a tight smile, but it vanished before Clara could respond. "Afternoon," Clara said quietly. One of them, a redhead with polished boots, looked up and said, not unkindly, "You must be adjusting just fine up there. Heard Jeremiah gave you full reign of the house already." Another woman chuckled, "Too loud?" Clara nodded once. "Lila's been eating more." "That's something?" The redhead tilted her head. "You trying to be her mama or just keeping the seat warm?" That night, Clara didn't eat much. She sat on the porch until long after dark, her hands folded in her lap, the fabric for Lila's dress untouched beside her. That's when she heard the creak of a cane. She looked up to see an older woman approaching, short, bent, wrapped in a thick shawl, her steps slow but steady. "I thought I might find you out here," the woman said, settling beside her with a heavy sigh. Clara blinked. "Do I know you?" "No, but I knew Jeremiah's wife." The woman's eyes were sharp, pale blue. "Anna was my niece." Clara sat up straighter. "I'm Ruth," she said, holding out a gnarled hand. "I knew you weren't from here. Elk Rock's got a way of showing teeth to new folks." Clara smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." They sat in silence for a moment, the cold not biting, but settled like an old friend. "You've been kind to the child," Ruth said eventually, "and patient. That's more than I expected. I'm not sure she wants me here," Clara admitted. "Doesn't matter." Ruth looked out into the yard. "Love's not always about want." Sometimes it's about staying. Clara nodded slowly. Jeremiah, Ruth added, he was never cold before. Quiet, yes. But Anna brought him color. After she died, he painted the whole house gray. Even the trim used to be yellow. Clara glanced toward the porch rail. She could almost see it, bright mustard yellow, beneath layers of dull. Ruth leaned closer, her voice low. You're not the only one carrying ghosts. They sat a while longer, the wind whispering around them like stories not yet told. Then Ruth asked, so softly Clara almost missed it, tell me, child, are you more afraid of people's judgment or of a heart colder than this Wyoming snow? Clara had no answer, but the question followed her inside and stayed long into the night. There are two kinds of women, those who wait and those who build. Clara Mae Whitmore had never been good at waiting. Waiting was for those who could afford time, or the comfort of knowing someone else would act in their place. But she had learned on battlefields, in train stations, in narrow rented rooms that survival belonged to those who moved, who planted, who stirred, who held trembling hands through fevered nights. So now, under a roof not yet hers, beside a child who barely met her eyes, Clara chose to build. It started small. She brought out the sewing tin one morning after breakfast, threads in shades of forest and rust, needles tucked into felt. She sat by the window and began to stitch on a square of muslin, her hands steady from years of habit. Lila watched from across the room, curled into the edge of the couch, legs tucked beneath her. Clara said nothing at first. Just let the quiet settle around them. The only sound the ticking of the parlor clock and the soft pull of thread through cloth. After a few minutes, Clara slid the needle into the cushion and reached into her apron pocket. I found this in the attic, she said, holding up a bundle of fabric scraps. Your mama's. Would you like to help me sew something with them? Lila looked, blinked once, then looked away. But she didn't leave the room. That afternoon, Clara made sugar biscuits, the ones with cinnamon on top, soft inside, with just enough crunch on the edges. She left one on a small plate by Lila's favorite chair. It was gone before sunset. By the end of the week, Lila had moved closer, just a few feet, close enough to hand Clara a scrap of yellow calico, then sit cross-legged and watch her stitch it into the growing quilt. One evening, Clara read aloud, not fairy tales or nursery rhymes, but the kind of stories she remembered from long ago, fables about rivers and mountains, of wolves who lost their howl and found it again. Her voice was gentle, rhythmic, never dramatic. She didn't look up to see if Lila was listening, but when she paused between pages, a quiet voice whispered, "What happens next?" The snow outside continued to fall, thick and steady, wrapping the world in a stillness that muted every sound but breath and heartbeat. And just as steadily, something began to shift inside the house. Clara no longer tiptoed around the kitchen like a guest. She cooked without asking, rearranged the pantry, left a small jar of wild honey by Jeremiah's place at the table. He never said a word, but he started finishing his supper. They rarely spoke beyond what needed saying, but once, as she passed him in the barn, he paused long enough to nod toward the main house. "Smells like cinnamon again," he said. Clara didn't reply. But she carried that sentence with her all day like a pebble in her palm, small, but real. Then, one night, the warmth cracked. It began with a cough, then another. Clara was mending a hem when she heard it from Lila's room. Sharp, dry, from the chest. Not like a winter sniffle, this was deeper. She knocked once before entering. Lila lay curled in bed, her cheeks flushed too red, her breathing shallow. Her forehead was slick with sweat, and her eyes were glassy with fever. Clara moved quickly. She felt the child's forehead, then her pulse, not panic, just purpose. She brought in cool cloths, a pot of water, willow bark tea, and the basin from the washroom. Through the night, she stayed, never leaving the room. She read aloud when Lila whimpered, held her when she shook, sang softly not songs with words, just soft sounds when the girl stirred in her sleep. Sometime before dawn, Jeremiah appeared in the doorway. He didn't enter, just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes shadowed in the low lamplight. Clara looked up, nodded once, then turned back to Lila. "She'll be all right," she said, her voice hushed but certain. "It's just the fever." He didn't speak, but he stayed a while longer, watching, then disappeared into the hall like a thought too heavy to finish. Morning broke slowly, gray and quiet. Clara dozed for a moment beside the bed, her body curled into the worn armchair, the quilt half over her lap. The tea had gone cold, and the fire in the hearth burned low. She woke to warmth on her hand, a small hand, resting there, still. She looked down. Lila was awake, pale but aware, her breathing steadier, and her tiny fingers wrapped around Clara's. The girl didn't speak, didn't smile. She just moved slow, deliberate, and leaned her head into Clara's lap. It was the first time she had touched her without flinching. Clara's eyes blurred. She didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply. Afraid to break the moment, outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, something else had begun to thaw. Later, as Lila drifted back to sleep, Clara sat by the fire with the quilt square in her hands. Her stitches were slower now, gentler. She smiled just barely, a soft, quiet curve of the mouth. For the first time in years, it wasn't forced. There, in that flicker of warmth and fabric and breath, she felt it, a spark beneath the snow, and she would keep it alive. Sometimes, storms don't come from the sky. The wind had shifted that morning, sharp, restless, full of that eerie stillness that settled before a blizzard. But it wasn't the sky Clara noticed. It was the man on horseback, dark against the white horizon, riding up the path like he owned the land. Jeremiah stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed as the rider approached. Clara watched from the parlor window, the hem of her apron clenched in one hand. The man dismounted slowly, brushing snow from his coat. He was taller than Jeremiah, broader in the shoulders, with a thick mustache and a glint in his eye that didn't speak of kindness. There was something in the way he moved casual, but calculating, like a fox circling a coop. "Franklin Dade," Jeremiah said flatly. Clara tensed. The name was unfamiliar, but Jeremiah's voice had dropped half an octave, and that alone said enough. "Came to talk about the girl," the man replied, brushing past him toward the porch. "We both know she ain't yours." "She's blood," Jeremiah said. "That's enough. Blood's not custody," Franklin said, removing his gloves with slow precision. "I've been reading the statutes, thinking it might be time I stepped in." "Properly?" "Inside the house." Clara moved closer to the door, keeping to the shadows. Lila sat upstairs, reading by the fire. She didn't need to hear this, not now. Not ever. "I've raised her," Jeremiah said. "She's safe here." Franklin tilted his head. "Safe, with a man who hides from town and a woman who married you faster than you could blink. Tell me, Boone, what exactly do you two offer that I can't?" Clara felt the sting of that question like a slap. Jeremiah didn't flinch. "You offer trouble? That's all you ever have." Franklin stepped closer. "I've got papers. I've got means. I've got time to make noise. You really want to fight this?" "Jeremiah." A long silence. Then, Jeremiah said, "Give me 3 days." Franklin smirked. "You've got 2. He mounted his horse and rode off, his figure swallowed by falling snow. That night, Jeremiah packed quietly. He didn't speak much, just told Clara he needed to go to Cheyenne, to speak with lawyers, to set things in motion that would protect Lila if it came to it. Clara didn't ask questions, but her hands were cold as she helped him gather documents and tuck them into a leather satchel. Before he left, he turned to her not with affection, but with something deeper. Trust. "Keep her safe," he said. "I will," Clara replied, her voice steady. "With everything I've got." The storm came the next night. It rolled in without mercy howling winds. Snow so thick it erased the world outside. The windows rattled, the lanterns flickered, the horses in the barn kicked at their stalls. Clara moved Lila into her room, closer to the fire. She boiled water for tea, kept blankets stacked by the door, and sat with her sewing in hand, though her eyes rarely left the window. At midnight, a sound, not the wind, not the creak of old wood, but the front latch clicking. She stood slowly. Her heart didn't race. It sank deep into her belly, heavy and cold. She reached behind the coat rack, where Jeremiah kept the rifle. Her fingers trembled only for a second. Then she lifted it, just like he'd shown her, and walked to the door. A shadow loomed just beyond the glass. And then a fist hard pounded twice. "Open up," Franklin's voice, muffled by the storm. "Ain't fit to be out here." Clara said nothing. She backed away, rifle aimed steady, breath shallow. He pounded again. "Don't be foolish, girl. You think a wedding ring makes you a mother. I've got claim." Then, the sound of wood cracking. The door didn't break, but it shifted, just enough to scream danger. Clara turned on her heel and ran for the stairs. "Lila," she hissed, bursting into the room. "Get up. Now. Come with me." The girl obeyed without question. Something in Clara's voice left no room for fear, only action. Together. They moved down the hall, past the kitchen, into the back pantry. Clara yanked open the trapdoor beneath the rug and guided Lila into the cellar, dark, musty, lined with shelves of canned fruit and potatoes. She closed the hatch, pulled the iron latch shut, and leaned back against the wood. Then silence. Only the breath of the child beside her, the smell of earth and cold apples, the weight of what she held in her lap, the rifle. Above, a creak, floorboards shifting, heavy boots crossing the kitchen. Clara pulled Lila closer, wrapped an arm around her, and whispered, "No matter what, I won't let him take you." The girl nodded, wide-eyed but calm. She reached for Clara's hand in the dark, and Clara gripped it like a promise. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, another had begun. Clara had never killed a man, but tonight she might. The weight of the rifle in her hands wasn't just metal and wood. It was fear, memory, and something fiercer, a resolve she didn't know still lived in her bones. She sat on the cellar steps, breath shallow, every muscle taut. Lila trembled against her side. The little girl's face pressed tightly into Clara's coat, one small fist clinging to her skirt like an anchor. The air was thick with earth and quiet dread. Above them, footsteps moved slowly, deliberately across the creaking boards of the kitchen. Clara's finger hovered near the trigger. Her pulse thudded in her ears, loud and urgent. She didn't want violence, but she'd seen what men like Franklin were capable of, and she knew what it meant to hesitate. Her mind flicked, unbidden, to the field hospitals of the war, to blood, screams, the unsteady rise and fall of breath beneath her hands. Back then, she'd fought to keep life in. Tonight, she was prepared to take it out if she had to. A floorboard groaned above them. Lila whimpered, barely audible. Clara pulled the girl closer, wrapping her left arm around her like a shield. She whispered gently, "Shh. I've got you. No one's taking you." Time passed in uneven drops. Then a sudden slam. The back door, blown wider by the wind or forced open again. Silence followed, heavy, waiting. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Clara's grip on the rifle began to ache. She waited. At last, when no more sounds came, no steps, no voices, no doors, she carefully unlatched the cellar hatch and crept up the final steps. The lantern she'd left on in the parlor flickered in the corner of her vision, casting nervous shadows across the kitchen walls. Snow had blown in through the back door, which now hung wide open. The cold sliced in sharp and bitter. A chair had been knocked over. Her boots, lined neatly by the door earlier, were scattered, but there was no one in the house. He had left. For now. She secured the door with the iron bolt and pulled the curtain closed. Then she returned for Lila, who waited just where she'd left her, arms wrapped around her knees. Clara knelt. "It's all right now. Come, sweetheart. Let's stay close to the fire." The child didn't ask questions. She only nodded and took Clara's hand. Back in the parlor, Clara lit a second lantern and set a kettle over the flames. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Lila curled on the couch beneath a quilt, eyes wide open, watching every move Clara made. The rifle remained on the table just in reach. Somewhere near 2 a.m, a loud knocking made them both jump. Clara rose again, rifle in hand, but this time, a voice called from outside. "It's Caleb Bennett from the East Ridge." She opened the door an inch, just enough to see the neighbor, his coat dusted with snow, concern written clear across his weathered face. "Saw someone cutting through your back pasture," he said. "Didn't look right. Came as quick as I could." Clara's shoulders sagged not in defeat, but in delayed relief. "He broke in," she said quietly. "Franklin Dade." Caleb's eyes darkened. "The brother." She nodded. "He's gone now. For the moment. I'll stay till morning," Caleb said. "Sheriff's on his way." Clara gave a tired nod. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and disappeared into the barn to stand watch. But Clara didn't rest. Even when the house was quiet again, even with the child beside her, warm beneath layers of blankets, she sat in the rocking chair near the fire, the rifle across her knees, listening for every creak, every gust of wind. Lila drifted off sometime after 3. Her hand slipped into Clara's, small and warm. The fire burned low, the wind howled, and Clara sat like a sentry, like a mother wolf who had finally chosen her den and was prepared to defend it. The sound of hooves came just before dawn, fast, urgent. Then a second sound, boots hitting snow, a door thrown open, Jeremiah. He burst through the threshold, covered in frost and breathless. "Clara," he called out, scanning the room. "Lila." "We're here," Clara said, her voice steady but quiet. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his eyes taking in the rifle, the overturned chair, the cold ash on her sleeve, and the red stain spreading across the upper part of her arm. His face drained of color. "You're hurt." "Just a scrape," Clara said. He looked at her longer this time. Really looked, not through her, not past her, but into the heart of what she had done, what she had become. Lila stirred, sat up, and blinked at him with sleepy eyes. She slid off the couch, walked straight into his arms, and whispered, "Don't ever let her go." "Papa." Jeremiah's arms tightened around the girl, then reached, slowly, toward Clara. His hand hovered for a breath, then rested on her shoulder. Warm, steady. Not a man offering gratitude, but something else. The beginning of a home. He thought he had buried his heart with his wife. He was wrong. The storm had passed, but the house still held its echo. The floor creaked differently in the stillness. The walls, though unmoved, seemed to lean in closer, as if waiting for something to be said at last. Clara stood at the basin, washing the blood from Jeremiah's hands. The water had cooled. The cloth was red-streaked, heavy with the night before. He hadn't asked for help, but he hadn't pulled away either. His knuckles were split, his skin raw from gripping reins through wind and snow. She cleaned them gently, the way she had tended broken soldiers, silent, focused, reverent. Jeremiah watched her hands, rough, strong hands, but tender in their movements. He had seen them cradle Lila, pull her from fear, hold a rifle without trembling, and now they touched him with a kind of quiet forgiveness he didn't deserve. "I owe you more than an apology," he said finally, his voice low and uneven, "and I reckon I'm long overdue." Clara didn't stop. She wrung the cloth slowly and began again, wiping along the inside of his palm. "Anna was everything I never expected to have," he continued, bright, wild. "She lit up the world just by stepping into it. When she got sick after Lila came, I thought it was just exhaustion. But within 2 weeks, she was gone. And the baby too." He swallowed hard, looking at the table rather than her. They buried the child with her. I couldn't even name her. I dug the grave myself, behind the cottonwood tree. Took me all day in frozen ground, and I put my heart down there with them. Clara paused. Her hand rested on his wrist. The fire crackled behind her. She didn't speak, just listened. I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life, Jeremiah said, voice quieter now. Didn't know how to raise a girl when I couldn't even hold her without shaking. So, I hired help. Shut up the rooms she used to sit in. Painted over the yellow trim she loved. I thought if I made the world quiet enough, maybe I wouldn't have to hear the missing. His jaw tightened, and he shook his head once. When the lawyer told me I needed a wife to keep the ranch, I thought I was doing the right thing, a practical thing. I never meant to treat you like a hired hand, but I did, and worse. I kept you at arm's length. I watched you earn everything and gave you nothing back. Clara folded the cloth neatly and set it aside. Still, she said nothing. He looked at her then. I was scared. Clara, he admitted, not of you, but of what I might feel if I let myself love again. Because loving once cost me everything. And I thought, maybe I couldn't survive losing again. The space between them held more than words. It held weeks of unspoken things. Meals shared without eye contact. Nights passed in quiet corners. The comfort of a child's first touch. The terror of almost losing her. And now, at last, the truth. Clara moved to the cupboard and pulled down a fresh cloth. She poured hot water from the kettle into a bowl and returned to his side, soaking and wringing the fabric with practiced ease. She dabbed at a scratch along his collarbone, then the bruise blooming near his jaw. He didn't flinch. Still silent, she took his right hand again, pressing the warm cloth into his palm and gently guiding his fingers open. She had no words. But she gave him presence, and sometimes, presence is the purest form of forgiveness. He reached into his coat pocket. I didn't plan to do this here, he said, almost shy, not after a night like that. But maybe it's exactly when it ought to happen. He opened a small velvet box. Inside was a simple ringgold, no ornament, just a quiet gleam in the firelight, worn, like it had waited for someone who understood weathered things. I bought it in Cheyenne, he said, not for duty, not for appearances, but for love. Clara's breath caught. I want to marry you again, Jeremiah said, not for Lila's sake, not to save the ranch, but because somewhere between silence and snowfall, I realize you're the first person I've let into my soul since I buried them, and I don't want to close that door again. Her hand moved to her chest, pressing gently as if trying to keep her heart steady. She had been proposed to once before by necessity, with cold words and a businesslike tone. Now, standing here in a house that had once felt like a prison, she was being asked in warmth, in honesty, in the aftermath of fire and storm. Clara blinked, and the tears came slow, steady, unhurried. She didn't wipe them away. They traced down her cheeks like rain that had waited too long, the first she had cried since the war, since holding a dying soldier's hand while he begged for his mother, since watching the train disappear, carrying away the last of her old life. Now, she cried because something inside her had cracked open finally and found sunlight waiting on the other side. She stepped forward and took the box from his hands. Then she looked at him, eyes wet but clear. Yes, she whispered, yes. And for the first time since the winter began, Jeremiah Boone smiled. There were no violins, but there was truth, no crowd, but a home full of love. The sunrise painted the sky in pale rose and gold, a quiet promise in the stillness over the Boone homestead. The air was crisp but calm, as though the world knew that something beautiful was about to bloom in the thaw after the storm. Inside, everything felt soft with expectation. The parlor, usually tidy and subdued, shimmered now with fresh flowers gathered from a neighbor's meadow, independent blooms of daisies and wild asters in mason jars, bright against the gray walls. Clara stood before the mirror in what passed for a wedding dress in her world, her navy wool dress from her first day in Elk Rock. Pressed and worn, but dignified. She'd added a pinch of lace at the collar, not because she was vain, but because she wanted something gentle for today. When she looked at her reflection, she saw strength there, not desperation. She saw someone who had come through loss and fear and chosen love on the other side. Lila, in a pale blue dress that Clara had made in secret, clutched her hand. She watched Clara's face with eyes wide and shining. Clara knelt and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "My heart," Lila whispered. Clara's voice quivered with emotion. "And mine?" Outside, the porch door creaked. Jeremiah stepped onto the threshold wearing his best shirt and vest and a tie Clara had found in the attic drawers. He didn't look at her dress or the wildflowers. He only looked at her. His breath caught. Clara's shoulders squared with that gesture. He cleared his throat. Clara Mae Whitmore. Her name sounded sacred in his voice. Tears sprang in her eyes. He shifted, unsteady but determined. In the parlor, they stood together, with Lila on one side and the memory of Anna's empty seat on the other. Jeremiah reached into his pocket and pulled out the small ring, still worn and warm from his touch. He slid it onto Clara's finger. And then he recited the words he wanted to live by. "I promise to choose you every day, not because I need you to finish the ranch, but because my life feels more complete with you in it. I promise to stand beside you in frost and fire, to honor you and to never let you go." Clara blinked past tears. He didn't look at Lila or the quilt or the flowers. He looked at her. The way he looked said everything that words could not. When he finished, Clara raised her hand, steady and sure. "I promise to be your partner, to love you without claim, and to build this life together, and not just for the family, but because being with you is the only kind of love I ever wanted." The parlor didn't ring with applause or music, just the quiet hum of their hearts beating in sync. Then, Lila tugged Clara's hand. "Come on, Mama," she said, voice light with truth. "Let's start this." Clara nodded, smiling through tears she didn't bother to hide. As they stepped outside into the morning, the porch became their aisle. Wildflowers bent in gentle approval. The scent of pine and promise hung in the air. A few neighbors gathered, Mrs. Ruth with her shawl, Caleb Bennett standing tall, and a couple of others who had seen enough frost and fear in their lives to know when something real had arrived. There were no violins, no grand procession burning the eyes, just silence, and then, softly, murmurs of blessing. Clara and Jeremiah stood together under the oak tree by the front gate. He wrapped an arm around her, and she leaned in. They shared a kiss that was neither quick nor ceremonial. It was a kiss filled with promises kept, with promises new, with love chosen, not arranged. Lila danced around them, twirling until Clara scooped her up and whispered, "We're a family now." Lila beamed, and Clara felt it too, a warmth deeper than any she had known. Later, after the morning sun had lifted higher and the porch had emptied, they went inside to their bedroom, the west room where she first arrived. Everything had shifted. The quilts no longer looked abandoned. The warmth of people stood in the corners. The vestiges of loss were there, yes, but tempered with life, renewed. Clara looked at Jeremiah, still holding Lila, still smiling softly. She thought of the night she came to his door, desperate for shelter. Now, she was home, not just in body, but in heart. And for the first time in a long while, the world felt like it was brimming with quiet joy. In that new room filled with the scent of wood polish and fresh blankets, they closed the door behind them. No spotlight, no lacy gown, just love, chosen, real, and finally theirs. She once healed bodies. Now, she heals hearts. Spring came late to Elk Rock that year, as if the land needed time to remember what warmth felt like. But when it did arrive, it came in a rush green threading through the valley, birdsong rising like laughter, and wildflowers nodding in the wind like old friends returning home. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, just past the barn, where the tall grass bent beneath her boots. Beside her stood Jeremiah, his arm resting lightly across her shoulders, and before them sat the little white building with the slate roof and the hand-carved sign that read Boone Meadow Clinic. It was small, just 2 rooms, 1 window each, but it was sturdy and full of light, built from timber harvested the previous fall, nailed and raised by neighbors who had once called her a stray. Now they brought her preserves and hand-knitted blankets. They brought stories and pain, and they left with less of both. Inside the clinic, a modest exam table stood beside the shelf of remedies she'd collected over the years. Dried lavender for calming, chamomile and honey, a scalpel sharp enough to cut pain clean. And on the wall, above the desk where she wrote her notes, hung a framed drawing done in bright crayon colors. Lila's drawing, a red-roofed house, a tall man with a beard, a woman in a blue dress holding a little girl's hand. Behind them stretched fields of yellow flowers and snow-capped mountains in the distance. At the bottom, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, my family, home. Clara had cried when Lila gave it to her, not from sadness, but from the sudden, beautiful weight of belonging. She had built a life from ash and silence, brick by brick, 1 meal, 1 bandage, 1 touch at a time. Franklin Dade had returned once, a few months after the wedding papers in hand, threats on his lips, but the sheriff met him at the station, and so did Caleb Bennett and 3 other ranchers, all of whom now called Jeremiah, friend, and Clara, sister. He didn't stay long. The law was on her side now, but more than that, so was the town. They didn't whisper anymore. They waved. Mrs. Ruth sent fresh loaves weekly. The dressmaker offered Clara a new gown for church, free of charge, and each Sunday, when they passed the wooden pews hand in hand, people smiled not with curiosity, but with kinship. Jeremiah had changed too, not drastically, not loudly, but like the slow melting of a river's ice. He spoke more. He laughed sometimes. He kissed Clara's temple when he passed behind her in the kitchen. And every night, he read Lila to sleep, his voice low and steady, while Clara listened from the hallway, heart full. And Clara, she had become something more than survivor. She was healer again, but not in the frantic, blood-soaked way of wartime. She healed differently now. A farmer with a sprained wrist, a child with fever and no coin to pay, a woman who lost her husband and couldn't find her breath. They came to her, not just for medicine, but for presence. She gave them time, stillness, a voice that listened, and hands that soothed. And slowly, Elk Rock became a place not of exile, but of grace. One afternoon, as the spring wind danced through the meadow, Clara stood in the doorway of the clinic, apron dusted with flour, cheeks warm from the sun. Lila was playing under the cottonwood, her laughter echoing off the hills. Jeremiah walked up the path, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. "New books," he said, for the waiting bench. Clara took the bundle with a smile. "You spoil me. I'm just making up for lost time," he replied, brushing a thumb against her cheek. She leaned into the touch. Time well spent. Later that evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch, a quilt around their shoulders, the sky turning gold. Lila crawled into Clara's lap, sleepy and safe. Jeremiah reached for Clara's hand and held it without words. And Clara looked out over the field toward the clinic, toward the valley, toward everything she had once thought she'd lost. She took a deep breath, the kind that fills the soul. The wind lifted strands of her hair, tugging them gently across her face. And in a voice barely louder than the breeze, she whispered, "Home, at last." The house behind them hummed with warmth. The world was still, and love, quiet. Steady love sat with them there, because love isn't always born in fire. Sometimes it's built brick by brick, through snow, through silence, and through second chances. Sometimes The second chapter of life begins where you least expect it, on the edge of despair, in the hands of strangers, or within the walls of a place that doesn't yet feel like home. Clara's journey reminds us that healing doesn't always come through grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Often, it arrives in quiet acts of care, shared burdens, and the courage to try again when trust feels like a distant memory. For those of us who've lost more than we've gained, who carry years lined with silence and sacrifice, her story offers a gentle truth. It is never too late to build something new, not from perfection, but from presence, not from promises, but from persistence. Love doesn't have to be loud. It can grow in the small spaces between meals prepared without words, in a child's touch, or the steady return of footsteps at dusk. This story teaches us that home isn't a place, it's a choice, a series of small, faithful decisions to stay, to care, and to believe again. And maybe that's the bravest kind of love there is. Thank you for spending your time with us here at Wild West Echoes. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor resilience, love, and second chances. Your support helps us keep these echoes alive. We're grateful you're part of this journey,